Today's games play it safe. That's not to say a lot of games aren't playable in a lot of ways, but history will remember the games and the developers that decided to push the hardware to its limits. As you'd expect, there's plenty of PS1 games that demanded a lot out of the console, but managed to deliver in so many ways. And all while on hardware that came out the same year as Junior, a movie that pushed my eyes to their limits. Hello viewers, it's good to see you. I'm Will from Cultured Vultures. Pregnant Arnold Schwarzenegger will visit my dreams tonight. And these are the PS1 games that squeezed every drop out of the console. We're big fans of Vagrant Story around these parts, so you might be side-eyeing this choice as we return to the well once again. But Square's unique take on action RPGs and platforming definitely ranks high amongst the PS1 games that push the console's capabilities almost to their breaking point. Telling the story of a risk breaker by the name of Ash, who is framed for the murder of a prominent duke while pursuing a mysterious cult leader, you're forced to explore the catacombs underneath the town of Learmonde. Though when you encounter monsters, the gameplay switches to a pausable real-time battle mode similar in concept to Parasite Eve. The fact that Square hasn't tried to port this bad boy to modern platforms is completely baffling to us. While the gameplay might take a bit of getting used to if you prefer regular action RPG combat, the reason why Vagrant Story pushed the PS1 to its limits has to do with the game's incredible graphics. Vagrant Story was far from Square's first fully 3D game, but it was their first RPG to feature the same character models across gameplay and cutscenes, so a painstaking level of detail was applied to pretty much every character model in the whole game, even if those characters only appeared for a couple of seconds. Beyond that, the cutscene direction, lighting and atmosphere was light years beyond what anyone else was capable of at the time, which is even more impressive when you consider that Vagrant Story was developed by the Final Fantasy Tactics team, who had previously only worked on 2D pixel art games. The fact that they were able to come together and create something this fantastic was nothing short of miracle work. This is the last time our children or our children's children will mention Vagrant Story. For 3 weeks. From one Square game that deserves to be ported to more platforms to another game that has been given plenty of deserved time in the spotlight, Final Fantasy IX is considered by some to be the best RPG on the PS1 and among the best games on the console, period. A lot of the game's love and positive reception has to do with the choices made regarding the story and world, with Square returning to a more medieval inspired world compared to the techno-magic blends of Final Fantasy VII and VIII. Given that the most recent Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy XVI, was also returned to its medieval roots, maybe that's all the confirmation we need to say that Final Fantasy XVII is going back to all the techie stuff. Or maybe we can just go on a road trip with some dragons this time, who knows? Like Vagrant Story, Final Fantasy IX's graphical quality made it a true console tester on the PS1, as Square released this game at the very tail end of the PS1's lifespan. All the work and experience Square had done on Final Fantasy VII and VIII were used to full effect to create one of the most gorgeous looking RPGs on any console. This isn't to say that the previous games looked bad, of course, oh no, with Final Fantasy VII's tone and atmosphere in Midgar helping cement its place among the classics on the PS1. It's just like the way San Andreas felt like such a massive step up from GTA 3 on the PS2. The lush visuals of Final Fantasy IX really tested the full range of the PS1's abilities, to the point where Square really had to go above and beyond to top it with Final Fantasy X, less than 1 year later. Never ask a woman her age, a man his salary, and Square what they were feeding their developers in the late 90s and early 2000s. Also, don't ask us to choose between this next game, Urban Reign, and Carl Urban, because we simply will not. Some games push things a little too far, collapsing under the weight of its own ambition in the process. Urban Chaos is a prime example of the latter, and although the game was decently regarded when it was released on PC, the PS1 version of the game was widely slammed. Functionally, there isn't much difference in terms of the two games when it comes to content, but the execution on the PS1 absolutely left something to be desired. Despite the lackluster reviews for Urban Chaos, it can't be denied how much it helped cement the possibility legacy of proper open world 3D action games, paving the way for games like GTA 3 to take the medium further. Urban Chaos allowed players to explore small urban areas across 24 levels, and while the areas you could travel through were compact, players were given the ability to explore most of the buildings within that area, making this tightly controlled area somewhere dense and filled with things to discover. On top of that, Urban Chaos was pretty innovative for an open world game at the time, in that it allowed players to approach objectives from multiple angles, or complete side quests and find power-ups in the level before full sending the main quest, instead of just cracking skulls the same way over and over again. As mentioned earlier, it's not a perfect PC port, with the ambitiousness of Urban Chaos probably more suited to a PS2 release. But that's the risk you take when you're trying to test the limits of a console. Sometimes those limits end up breaking the spirit of a Japanese game developer when they don't go home for Christmas. Is it cheating to include a simulation racing game in this list of titles that push the console to its limits? We're going to say no, because Gran Turismo set the new standards for an entire genre when it launched on the PS1 in 1994. And also, we can cheat if we like, we're literal birds, and bird jail does not exist. Just don't put a blanket over us and make us think it's 2 AM. We see through your lies. Ooh, sleep time. Considering that Gran Turismo was in development for around 5 years, you'd expect the game to make full use of the PS1. But according to the game's director, Kazunori Yamanouchi, the original Gran Turismo used an estimated 75% of the console's performance. Even with that 25% left over though, Polis Entertainment, who would later be known as Polyphony Digital, created a racing game with better graphics, physics and presentation than some ever thought possible on the PS1, or that we'd ever see in gaming. You would really not believe the graphical leap if you were there, trust me. While the original Gran Turismo would not include any real-life tracks like other games in the series would go on to do, it did feature well over 100 licensed vehicles, each pretty accurately recreated using the PS1's hardware. As far as realistic depictions go, Gran Turismo's recreations of classic automobiles were unmatched at the time. You could make the case that Gran Turismo 2 pushed the limits even further, offering much more in terms of cars, tracks and modes, but the 2 years of development time in between GT1 and GT2 showed in a number of unfortunate bugs and glitches. Meanwhile, GT1 is the highest selling game on the entire PS1, along with being one of the most well-reviewed games for the console. You really can't compete with a legacy like that. Caniacs rejoice as we're finally being blessed with the announcement of Soul Reaver and its sequel getting a remaster. It took them long enough, eh? While Soul Reaver 2 is a brilliant action platformer in its own right on the PS2 and PC, there's nothing really compared to that iconic PS1 release of the original game. Even if the Legacy of Kain series had been around already since 1996 Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, alternative titled Jaw, The Revenge, was a beautiful refresh and a relaunch for the series, while still retaining plot and references for those who fell in love with Blood Omen. As the second game in this absolutely bonkers time-travelling cosmic horror goth opera, Soul Reaver's gameplay and world designs are what really tested how versatile the PS1 was going to be. Ditching previous leading lad Kain for newcomer Raziel, Soul Reaver sees the titular Kain killing Raziel. Hell of an opener, honestly. The Elder God swiftly revives Raziel, or as swift as 1,000 years can feel, to become a Soul Reaver to exact revenge on Kain. No, the other Kain. That's it. Setting into motion this time, space and dimension hopping adventure. As a Soul Reaver, Raziel has the ability to swap between the material and spectral planes of existence, which allows him to solve platforming puzzles and reach new areas. Having 2 fully explorable 3D worlds that players could switch between almost instantly was considered to be a groundbreaking achievement at the time. And even now, games that have a similar gimmick to this just don't have the same impact that Soul Reaver did. It's question time, trivia fans. What was the weird Legacy of Kain MMO called? Let us know down below in the comments and you could win a Steam key for free. We love mentioning Wipeout because it allows us to do 2 very specific things. Number 1, we get to talk about Psygnosis? Psygnosis, or Sony Studio Liverpool as they would become known as, because no one could say Psygnosis, a UK-based developer who was taken away too soon. Big love to them. As for 2, we get to sneak in an F-Zero reference as the two games are kinda similar. Reset the counter! At one point during the PS1's lifespan, you'd think that Wipeout would have been one of the linchpins for Sony heading into the new millennium. But aside from a decent HD collection of the first 3 games on PS4, the Wipeout series is basically dead. Well, at least until someone at Sony can turn Wipeout into a third-person narrative-focused action-adventure game with light RPG elements where the ship somehow has a dead wife. You know what, that's pretty good, actually. Sign me up. Even if Wipeout has disappeared, there's no denying how much Studio Liverpool pushed the boat out with Wipeout 3, eking every little bit of horsepower out of the PS1 as they could. Like other games we've mentioned on this list, the reason why Wipeout 3 is a boundary pusher is that the development team had experience on the console already. But Wipeout 3's achievements are nothing to be sneezed at. Whether by the grace of God or some good old-fashioned elbow grease, the team at Studio Liverpool were able to boost the resolution of the game, outputting at 512 by 256, making it for one of the rare examples of a widescreen PS1 game, while also rewriting the console's render entirely in order to eliminate some of those pesky clipping and seaming issues that other games were riddled with. The fact that 2 square split screens of Wipeout 3 were outputting at the same resolution as the original Wipeout proves that Wipeout 3 was a true statement piece for the PS1 heading into its final year. Look, we're not exactly treading new ground when we say that without Driver, GTA 3 and beyond probably wouldn't exist in the form that it did. The Driver games, particularly that first game, proved that it was possible to get behind the wheel and explore a bustling cityscape. Cursed tutorial car park notwithstanding. That's our one mention, we'll shut up now. Critical reception to Driver 1 was overwhelmingly positive, so naturally expectations were high for the upcoming sequel, but for some reason critics weren't as hot on Driver 2. Perhaps it's to do with the admittedly slow frame rate or the mountain of glitches because the game was rushed out of the door. Something that would bite Driver 3 in the arse a few years later. Remember kids, don't rush video game development or buy reviews. Want to see a video on the whole thing? Then let us know below. Even still, Driver 2's graphics are pretty decent and the gameplay follows the same pattern as the original game, with you solving most of your problems behind the wheel. However, Driver 2 added the ability to step outside the vehicle for some on-foot exploration. There were no action sections on foot, so open-world gaming fans would have to wait a year to see Driver 2 blown out of the water entirely. But again, the struggling frame rate proved that Driver 2 was pushing the console to its near limit. If nothing else, the game's FMVs were pushing the limits of CD storage, as due to the sheer amount of cutscenes, Driver 2's story had to be spread over 2 discs.
Fact, only good and revolutionary games get 2 discs. I didn't stutter, unlike Otacon when he sees a woman's face.
Arguably Kojima's magnum opus, or at least the game that allowed gaming's biggest Chad who's made the most of old DVDs become a household name the world over, Metal Gear Solid was a huge swing for both Kojima and Konami, one that arguably wouldn't get made today. Pitching a 3D stealth adventure game as a sequel to a niche series of 2D games mostly kept to Japanese hardware was probably pushing the limits of Konami's faith in Kojima before Norman Reedus' face broke that faith forever. But it would prove to be the right move when MGS became an overnight sensation for the PS1. The console was being stretched to its breaking points by Metal Gear Solid as well. Those snow effects came with a sacrifice after all. While the graphics and performance of Metal Gear Solid rank among some of the best in the entire generation, Kojima decided to get fancy with it by flexing the capabilities of the PS1 console and its various features through the Psycho Mantis fight. Having some gas mask wearing clown roasting you for the various games you've played depending on what was saved on your memory card.
You like Castlevania, don't you?
Along with the fact that you have to switch the controller port to gain the proper advantage over him, rank among some of the best gaming moments of all time. Pushing the limits of the console doesn't always require the shiniest graphics or the amount of frames per second, as Kojima's boundless creativity showed. The fact that MGS happens to be a technical masterpiece as well is just the icing on the memory card reading, arse-checking, bowel-bothering cake. The PS1 was a breeding ground for some of the best platformers ever made, including Crash Bandicoot, Croc and Bubsy 3D, our beloved. The one that managed to become a huge success and spawned plenty of sequels and love was Spyro the Dragon. Developed by a pre-Spider-Man, pre-Ratchet & Clank, pre-Fuse Insomniac, Spyro the Dragon delivered a different kind of 3D platformer to those that were available at the time. Levels were much more open for exploration, packed with minigames and interactables, while Spyro's abilities themselves offered a different take on the gathering the gubbins and getting to the goal. Using fire instead of stomping on an enemy's head is pretty radical thinking as platformers are concerned. What really impressed everyone was how the levels were rendered. Typically, PS1 games would try to mitigate the console's inability to render long distances by sticking large fog walls everywhere. But Spyro the Dragon sought an alternative solution. Insomniac used a 3D panoramic engine developed in-house by Alex Hastings that essentially allowed the game to display objects in various levels of detail depending on how far away they were from the player. Essentially, the game generated two versions of the level, with distant objects drawn in a textureless render to circumvent the PS1's limited RAM capabilities. It sounds like such a simple solution now, but back then it was a completely unexplored area in gaming, and it allowed Spyro to capture the imagination of players just as much as a man in a tiger mask did. A release that very nearly wasn't. Tekken 3 has been lauded amongst the greatest fighting games ever made, which is no small feat. A lot of fighting games are certified bangers, and when it comes to 3D games, Tekken is the undisputed king of Iron Fist. While Tekken 1 and 2 were ported relatively easily to the PS1, Tekken 3's arcade system was developed by Namco on System 12 hardware, an upgraded version of the Namco System 11 32-bit arcade board that Tekken 1 and 2 were developed on. NS12 offered much more in terms of processing power, which allowed Tekken 3 to have some of the best graphics and frame rate of the series up to that point. But the technological leaps of the arcade made porting the game to the PS1 a bit more difficult. Reportedly, even Namco reps stated to EGM that they didn't think it was possible to port Tekken 3 to the PS1, but they managed it. In order to make the Tekken 3 PS1 port work, certain concessions were made to ensure that the game still ran with a solid frame rate. With the backgrounds remade into 2D panoramic images, the polygon count for each of the characters was reduced slightly, and the PS1 ran it at a slightly lower resolution than the original arcade release. Aside from that though, Tekken 3 was almost an arcade perfect port, containing all the content from the arcade release along with some new modes and a couple of hidden characters. Before Tekken 3, most arcade games lost a lot in translation when they made the move to consoles, but Tekken 3 opened the door in some ways. Namco's efforts were rewarded, of course, as Tekken 3 would go on to sell over 8 million copies worldwide. And that is our list. What games do you like that really pushed the PS1's hardware? I certainly remember seeing Silent Hill for the first time on the PS1, and while that had a lot of fog, it was also a rare survival horror game that included fully 3D backgrounds, and I very much appreciated that. But tell us yours, let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.